In October of 54 CE, a 16-year-old boy stood before the Praetorian Guard and was proclaimed Emperor of Rome. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He had not sought this position through military conquest or political maneuvering. He had been placed there through years of manipulation by his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who had married the previous emperor, arranged her son's adoption, and then, according to most accounts, poisoned her husband to clear the path to power. Nero inherited an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. He inherited a court filled with people who had killed to reach their positions. He inherited a system where emperors were made and unmade not by law or tradition, but by the loyalty of soldiers, the calculations of advisors, and the tolerance of the Senate. The Roman imperial system was barely a century old. Augustus had created it through civil war and careful fiction, concentrating absolute power while claiming to restore the Republic. Tiberius had withdrawn into paranoia. Caligula had pushed autocratic boundaries until his guards stabbed him to death. Claudius had stumbled into power and then been poisoned, possibly by the woman now standing beside Nero. This was the machinery Nero inherited. Not stable government with clear succession, but permanent crisis held together by fear, violence, and the fiction that republican institutions still functioned. The Senate met and debated. Consuls were elected. But everyone understood that real power sat with whoever controlled the Praetorian Guard and could command enough loyalty or terror to avoid assassination. Nero was not prepared for this. He was a teenager educated in Greek literature and music, who had watched family members murdered for political convenience. His father had died when he was 3. His mother had been exiled when he was young, then returned with ambitions that reshaped the imperial court. He had been adopted by an emperor who already had a biological son, a son who would conveniently die before becoming a rival. The court that formed around Nero was not personally loyal to him. Agrippina had orchestrated the succession and expected to rule through her son. Seneca, the philosopher and former tutor, saw an opportunity to implement ideas of enlightened governance. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, controlled the only force that mattered in selecting emperors. There was no manual for being emperor, no constitution, no clear succession law, no institutional framework to contain or guide imperial power. Each emperor created his own method of rule, bounded only by the limits of what others would tolerate before plotting his death. Those limits were unclear and constantly shifting. Nero began with advantages. He was young, which meant he could be guided. He had no obvious vices that would alarm the Senate. He came from the Julio-Claudian bloodline, providing legitimacy. He had Praetorian support, secured through generous payment. He had intelligent counselors who understood the system. But he also began with fundamental instabilities. His mother expected to share power. The Senate feared any sign of tyranny. The people expected spectacle and generosity. The military needed competent leadership. The provinces required stable administration. These demands often contradicted each other, with no mechanism to resolve contradictions except through the emperor's will. In the 14 years that followed, Nero would navigate these contradictions with decreasing success. He would start as a guided figurehead delivering speeches written by Seneca. He would evolve into an increasingly independent ruler. He would kill his mother, his wife, his former tutor, and numerous senators. He would perform on public stages, rebuild Rome after fire, and construct a massive palace. He would lose military support, face revolt, and die abandoned by nearly everyone who had helped him take power. The story that survived him was shaped by his enemies. Hostile senatorial historians portrayed him as a monster who fiddled while Rome burned and persecuted Christians. These accounts became the foundation of how Nero has been remembered for 2,000 years. But they were written by men who had reason to exaggerate his crimes and ignore the structural failures of the system he inherited. What follows is an attempt to separate what probably happened from what was later invented. To understand Nero not as a cartoon villain, but as a young ruler trapped in an impossible system, making increasingly destructive decisions as control mechanisms broke down around him. Nero was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in December of 37 CE, 3 months after Caligula became emperor. His mother, Agrippina, was the great-granddaughter of Augustus and the sister of Caligula. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, came from a powerful aristocratic family, but died when Nero was 3 years old. This was the world of the Julio-Claudian court, where imperial relatives were both valuable political assets and permanent threats to whoever held power. Agrippina's early life had been defined by the violence of imperial succession. Her mother, also named Agrippina, had been starved to death by Tiberius. Her brothers had been killed or driven to suicide through similar means. She herself had been exiled by Caligula after being implicated in a conspiracy, though the details remain unclear. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 CE and Claudius became emperor, she was recalled from exile. Her son was 4 years old. Claudius was Agrippina's uncle, a scholar and administrator who had survived the purges of previous reigns by appearing harmless and ineffectual. His accession had been almost accidental. The Praetorian Guard found him hiding in the palace after Caligula's assassination and declared him emperor before the Senate could organize an alternative. He proved more capable than expected, conquering Britain and reforming provincial administration. But his court remained unstable and dangerous. For several years, Agrippina remained on the margins of court politics, raising her son while her uncle consolidated power. Claudius married Messalina, who used her position as empress to accumulate wealth and eliminate rivals. In 48 CE, Messalina's political maneuvering became too blatant to ignore, and Claudius had her executed. This created an opening. Agrippina understood the mathematics of imperial power better than almost anyone alive. She had watched emperors rise and fall. She had seen family members killed for being too close to the throne or too far from it. She knew that safety in the imperial court came only from holding power directly. Being the emperor's niece meant nothing. Being the emperor's wife meant everything. She convinced Claudius to marry her in 49 CE. Roman law forbade marriage between an uncle and niece, but the Senate granted a special exemption. She was now empress with access to the emperor's ear and control over who else had that access. She immediately began positioning her son for succession. Nero was 11 years old. He was brought into the imperial household and given the best education available. Seneca, recently recalled from exile, became his tutor. The philosopher taught him rhetoric, literature, and Greek culture. The education was genuinely sophisticated, preparing Nero for the intellectual demands of court life and public speaking. But it did not prepare him for the reality of how emperors were actually made and unmade. Claudius already had a biological son, Britannicus, from his marriage to Messalina. Britannicus was 3 years younger than Nero, and had a stronger claim to succession by blood. Agrippina needed to neutralize this advantage. In 50 CE, she persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero, making him legally part of the imperial family with the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The adoption placed Nero ahead of Britannicus in the succession order simply because he was older. The court watched these maneuvers with growing awareness of what they meant. Claudius was in his 60s, increasingly unwell. The question of succession hung over every political decision. Senators began aligning themselves with potential future emperors. The Praetorian Guard observed who paid them and who promised more. Agrippina cultivated relationships, distributed favors, and eliminated obstacles with careful precision. Nero himself had little agency in these arrangements. He was a teenager being positioned like a piece on a game board. He performed the role assigned to him, appearing in public wearing the toga of an adult citizen, giving speeches composed by his tutors, conducting himself with appropriate dignity. He showed interest in art, music, and theater. He demonstrated no obvious cruelties or disturbing behaviors. He was, by most accounts, a relatively normal aristocratic youth being prepared for a life of high-status irrelevance, except that his mother intended him to become emperor. In 53 CE, Nero married Claudius's daughter Octavia, further tying him to the imperial bloodline. The marriage made him simultaneously Claudius's adopted son and son-in-law, creating multiple lines of legitimacy. Britannicus was increasingly isolated, his mother dead, his political position weakening as Agrippina's network grew stronger. By 54 CE, everything was in place. Nero was 17, old enough to rule but young enough to be guided. He had the Julio Claudian name, an education from Rome's most famous philosopher, a marriage to the emperor's daughter, and a mother willing to do whatever was necessary to secure power. The only obstacle was Claudius himself. On October 13, 54 CE, Claudius died after eating mushrooms at a palace dinner. Most ancient sources claim he was poisoned by Agrippina. Some modern historians are more skeptical, noting that Claudius was old and unwell. But whether through poison or coincidence, his death came at precisely the moment that served Agrippina's interests. Britannicus, now 13, was passed over. The Praetorian Guard, already secured through payments and promises, proclaimed Nero emperor. The Senate ratified the decision because they had no alternative. A boy who had spent his childhood watching emperors murdered for political necessity was now the most powerful person in the world. The first months of Nero's reign suggested the possibility of stable government. The Senate received him with cautious optimism. His first speech to that body, written by Seneca, promised a return to the principles of Augustus, a coded way of saying that the emperor would respect senatorial dignity and not rule as a tyrant. He pledged to keep imperial business separate from his household, meaning that freedmen and palace officials would not control state policy as they had under Claudius. He promised that legal cases would be handled through proper courts rather than through imperial fiat. These were not empty promises. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, a period later historians would call the Quinquennium Neronis, the government functioned with unusual effectiveness. Seneca and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, formed what amounted to a regency, guiding the young emperor through the complexities of administration. Seneca handled policy and rhetoric. Burrus managed military, affairs, and controlled access to the emperor. Together, they created a buffer between Nero's inexperience and the demands of ruling an empire. The Senate responded positively to this arrangement. After the paranoia of Tiberius and the chaos of Caligula, followed by Claudius's reliance on freedmen administrators, a government that consulted senators and respected traditional procedures felt like a restoration of order. Nero attended Senate meetings. He listened to debates. He allowed prosecutors and defenders to speak fully in trials rather than deciding cases in advance. These were small gestures, but in the imperial system, where the emperor's mood could determine who lived and died, they mattered enormously. The young emperor also showed competence in public performance. He delivered speeches skillfully, using the rhetorical training Seneca had provided. He attended games and festivals, showing himself to the people of Rome with appropriate dignity. He distributed gifts to the Praetorian Guard and the urban poor, maintaining the economic patronage that kept the capital peaceful. He avoided the dramatic scandals that had marked previous reigns. But beneath this surface stability, fundamental tensions were already emerging. The most immediate was Agrippina's expectation that she would continue to hold real power. She had spent years positioning her son for the throne, eliminating rivals, and building networks of support. She had not done this to become irrelevant. She expected to govern through Nero, to be consulted on all major decisions, to share the honors and privileges of imperial authority. The sources describe her presence at official meetings, sitting behind a curtain to observe Senate proceedings, meeting with foreign ambassadors, and weighing in on policy decisions. Modern historians debate how much of this represents reality versus senatorial propaganda, designed to portray Nero as weak and dominated by a woman. Roman political culture found the idea of female power deeply threatening, and hostile historians may have exaggerated Agrippina's role to discredit Nero. But whether the details are accurate or embellished, the basic tension was real. Agrippina wanted power. Seneca and Burrus wanted to control policy through their access to Nero. Nero himself, as he matured from 16 to 17 to 18, began wanting to make his own decisions. These competing ambitions could not coexist indefinitely. The first casualty of this tension was Britannicus. Claudius's biological son represented a potential alternative focus for anyone dissatisfied with Nero's rule. In February of 55 CE, less than 4 months after Nero's accession, Britannicus died suddenly at a palace dinner. He was 13 years old. The official cause was declared to be epilepsy. Ancient sources claim he was poisoned on Nero's orders. The strategic logic for murder is clear. Britannicus was a permanent threat, someone around whom opposition could coalesce. His death removed that possibility. But whether Nero actually ordered it remains uncertain. The hostile sources attributed the decision to Nero personally, portraying it as his first act of independent cruelty. But Agrippina, or one of the factions at court, might have arranged it independently, seeing Britannicus as a threat to their own positions. What matters is not whether Nero killed Britannicus, but that everyone believed he might have. This is how the imperial system functioned, through fear and uncertainty about who was capable of what violence. An emperor who could order the death of his adopted brother could order anyone's death. This was the foundation of imperial power, the underlying threat that made all the polite speeches and legal procedures possible. The Senate understood this. They had lived through multiple reigns and knew the pattern. So they said nothing about Britannicus's death. They continued to vote honors to Nero. They participated in the fiction that the government operated through law and consensus rather than through the emperor's capacity for violence. Meanwhile, the actual work of governing continued. Provincial administration proceeded normally. Taxes were collected. Legal disputes were resolved. The military maintained order on the frontiers. Britain was being pacified after Claudius's conquest. The eastern frontier with Parthia remained stable. The empire functioned because it had systems and bureaucracies that operated regardless of who sat on the throne. This reveals something important about the imperial system. Most of the time, the emperor's personality and decisions mattered less than the underlying administrative machinery. The empire ran itself through governors, procurators, military commanders, and local elites who had their own interests in maintaining stability. The emperor's main role was to avoid disrupting this machinery through excessive interference or by creating so much instability that the system began to fracture. For his first 5 years, Nero mostly succeeded at this minimal standard. He stayed out of the way while Seneca and Burrus managed policy. He allowed the Senate to handle routine business. He appeared at ceremonies and festivals. He maintained the economic distributions that kept Rome's population content. The empire remained stable not because Nero was particularly skilled, but because he was not particularly disruptive. But this stability depended on the continued cooperation of the people around him. It depended on Agrippina accepting reduced influence. It depended on Seneca and Burrus maintaining their partnership. It depended on Nero remaining content to be guided rather than asserting his own authority. These dependencies would not last. The system had created an emperor with absolute power and then surrounded him with people trying to limit that power. The contradiction could not be sustained indefinitely. During these early years, the actual business of governing happened in a carefully choreographed collaboration between Nero and his advisors. Seneca crafted speeches that Nero delivered to the Senate. Burrus managed the Praetorian Guard and military appointments. The young emperor learned by observing and by following the guidance he received. This arrangement worked because it aligned the interests of everyone involved. Nero gained the appearance of competent rule without having to master the details. Seneca implemented his philosophical ideas about governance, and Burrus maintained security and order. The policies that emerged during this period reflected Seneca's influence more than Nero's preferences. Tax reforms aimed at reducing the burden on provinces and eliminating some of the corrupt practices of tax collectors. Legal reforms emphasized the importance of fair trials and the right to defense. The Senate was consulted on major decisions and given real authority over routine administration. These were the policies of a philosopher trying to create a more just and rational government within the constraints of autocracy. Foreign policy during this period was largely successful. The most significant challenge came from Armenia, a buffer kingdom between the Roman and Parthian empires. When Parthia installed a friendly king in Armenia in 54 CE, Rome responded by sending Corbulo, one of their most capable generals, to reassert Roman influence. The campaign was competently managed, with Corbulo eventually negotiating a settlement that preserved Roman prestige while avoiding a full-scale war with Parthia. This was diplomacy backed by military credibility, exactly how the empire was supposed to function. In Britain, the governor Suetonius Paulinus conducted campaigns to extend Roman control into Wales, culminating in an attack on the Druid stronghold on Anglesey in 60 CE. These operations followed the standard pattern of Roman expansion: military conquest, followed by administrative integration. The empire was still growing at its edges. still functioning as a military power capable of projecting force across vast distances. But even during this period of relative success, there were signs of the underlying tensions that would later emerge. Nero began to show interest in pursuits that the Senate considered inappropriate for an emperor. He wanted to perform publicly as a singer and actor. He wanted to race chariots. He wanted to participate in Greek-style athletic competitions. These were not inherently dangerous activities, but they violated Roman aristocratic norms about dignified behavior. The Roman elite had deep prejudices against public performance. Acting and singing were associated with slaves and freedmen, not with emperors. Athletic competitions in the Greek manner, where participants competed nude, seemed foreign and unseemly. An aristocrat might enjoy these entertainments as a spectator, but performing them publicly was considered degrading. For an emperor to do so was seen as a dangerous confusion of status and dignity. Seneca and Burrus tried to manage this interest by creating private venues where Nero could perform without public scandal. They organized games and performances within the palace or in controlled settings where only invited guests attended. This was a compromise. Nero could pursue his interests, but without violating public propriety. It worked for a while, but it was fundamentally unstable because it depended on Nero accepting limits to his behavior, and the entire logic of imperial power was that the emperor had no limits. The relationship with Agrippina continued to deteriorate. The sources describe escalating conflicts as Nero increasingly resented his mother's attempts to influence policy. Seneca and Burrus actively worked to limit her access to the emperor, seeing her as a threat to their own position. Agrippina reportedly tried to maintain influence by threatening to support Britannicus before his death and by making alliances with senators who might oppose Nero. In 55 CE, Nero began a relationship with Poppaea Sabina, a married aristocratic woman whom he would later marry. This created additional conflict with Agrippina, who saw the relationship as threatening because Poppaea might push Nero to divorce Octavia, Claudius's daughter and Nero's wife. Such a divorce would break one of the key legitimacy ties connecting Nero to the imperial bloodline. The sources claim that Agrippina responded to her declining influence by reminding Nero that she had made him emperor and could unmake him. Whether she actually said this, or whether it was invented by later historians, the sentiment reflects the reality of her position. She had accumulated debts and obligations throughout the court. She knew where the bodies were buried, literally in some cases. She represented both a connection to Nero's legitimacy and a potential threat if she turned against him. Modern historians view these accounts with skepticism because they fit too neatly into Roman stereotypes about dangerous women wielding inappropriate power. Agrippina became a stock figure in the sources, the manipulative mother, the woman who transgressed proper boundaries, the female who threatened male authority. Some of the specific incidents described may be invented or exaggerated, but the basic dynamic was real enough. Agrippina had played a central role in bringing Nero to power. She expected continued influence. Nero's other advisors wanted her excluded. Nero himself was becoming an adult and wanted independence. These competing pressures could not be reconciled through normal political channels because the imperial system had no normal political channels for resolving such disputes. There was no constitution, no clear law, no institutional mechanism for determining who actually held authority. By 59 CE, Nero was 21 years old. He had been emperor for 5 years. He had learned how the government functioned. He had developed his own interests and preferences. He had listened to advisers and followed their guidance, but he was increasingly aware that he did not have to. The entire apparatus of state existed to execute his will. The Senate voted him honors. The Praetorian Guard swore loyalty to him personally. The provinces paid taxes to support his government. The legal fiction was that he consulted and listened, but the reality was that his word was law. This creates a particular kind of psychological situation. Everyone around you tells you that you have absolute power. They explain that you are the pinnacle of human authority, that your decisions determine the fate of millions, that you are descended from gods. But simultaneously, they try to guide and limit and constrain your actual choices. They tell you what speeches to give, what policies to pursue, what relationships to avoid. The contradiction between unlimited theoretical power and practical constraint was inherent to the imperial system, and it created a permanent tension that different emperors resolved in different ways. Nero was beginning to resolve it by asserting his independence. The question was what form that independence would take. The breakdown of the guided regime happened gradually, not through a single dramatic rupture, but through accumulating decisions that shifted power away from Seneca and Burrus toward Nero himself. The young emperor began making choices that his advisers opposed, but could not prevent. He started spending more time with companions who encouraged his interest in performance and entertainment rather than in administration and policy. He became more willing to ignore advice that conflicted with his preferences. One early sign was the increasing prominence of Tigellinus, who would eventually replace Burrus as Praetorian prefect. Tigellinus came from a lower status background and had been exiled under Caligula for adultery with Agrippina. Nero recalled him and gave him positions of increasing authority. Unlike Seneca and Burrus, Tigellinus had no interest in limiting imperial behavior or maintaining senatorial dignity. He was willing to facilitate whatever the emperor wanted. This represented a fundamental shift in the character of court politics. Seneca and Burrus had operated on the principle that the emperor should be constrained by advisers who represented traditional values and institutional continuity. Tigellinus operated on the principle that the emperor's will was absolute and should be enabled rather than limited. Both approaches were possible within the imperial system, but they led to very different outcomes. Nero's relationship with Poppaea Sabina continued to develop. She was ambitious, intelligent, and interested in becoming empress herself. This required divorcing Octavia, Claudius's daughter, which would break a key symbolic connection to the previous reign. Seneca and Burrus opposed this divorce because they understood its political implications. Octavia's removal would signal that Nero no longer felt bound by the arrangements that had brought him to power. In 59 CE, while these tensions were building, Nero attempted to murder his mother. The ancient sources provide elaborate stories about how this happened. A collapsible boat designed to drown her, her survival, and then her eventual killing by soldiers who broke into her villa. Modern historians treat these details skeptically because they read like dramatic fiction. But most scholars accept that Nero did order Agrippina's death, even if the exact circumstances are uncertain. The killing of Agrippina represents a turning point. Whatever the specific justifications or circumstances, it demonstrated that Nero was willing to use violence to eliminate constraints on his power. He killed the person who had made him emperor, the most important patron and protector he had, because she had become an obstacle to his independence. The Senate's response to Agrippina's death reveals how the system actually functioned. They voted thanksgivings to the gods for Nero's survival of his mother's alleged conspiracy. They accepted the official story that Agrippina had been plotting against her son. They praised Nero's clemency and wisdom. This was not because they believed the official account, but because they understood that accepting it was safer than questioning it. Some senators privately understood what had happened, that an emperor had killed his mother to free himself from her influence. They understood that if an emperor could kill his mother, he could kill anyone. But they also understood that their survival depended on performing loyalty and avoiding giving the emperor any reason to see them as threats. So they voted the honors and spoke the expected words and participated in the public fiction that everything was normal. Seneca himself reportedly wrote the letter to the Senate explaining Agrippina's conspiracy and justifying her death. This has troubled scholars for centuries. How could a philosopher who wrote about virtue and justice help cover up a matricide? The most plausible explanation is that Seneca was trying to manage an impossible situation. If he refused to write the letter, someone else would write it, and he would lose his position as advisor. If he maintained his position, he might still restrain some of Nero's worst impulses. This was the logic of collaboration with autocracy. You participated in the system's crimes because refusing to participate simply meant losing influence without changing the outcome. But Agrippina's death marked the beginning of Seneca's declining influence. Nero had demonstrated that he would act violently when he felt constrained. He had broken the most fundamental social bond, the relationship between mother and son, to assert his freedom. This made him less predictable and less controllable. The philosopher's careful guidance meant less when the emperor was willing to ignore it. In 62 CE, Burrus died. The sources suggest he may have been poisoned, though this is uncertain. With Burrus gone, Nero appointed Tigellinus as sole praetorian prefect, replacing the partnership that had helped stabilize his early reign with a single commander who would not question imperial decisions. This was a deliberate choice to surround himself with enablers rather than restraints. Shortly after Burrus's death, Nero divorced Octavia and married Poppaea. Octavia was exiled, then accused of adultery and other crimes, and then executed. She was 22 years old. Her death served no strategic purpose beyond removing her as a potential symbol for opposition. The Senate raised no objections. They understood that objecting would be dangerous and futile. Seneca requested permission to retire. Nero refused, wanting to maintain the appearance that the philosopher still advised him. But Seneca's actual influence had diminished to almost nothing. He spent more time at his villas outside Rome, writing philosophy and trying to stay clear of court politics. The man who had tried to create an enlightened monarchy had watched it decay into something closer to tyranny, and he was powerless to stop it. By 62 CE, the structure that had made the first 5 years of Nero's reign relatively successful had collapsed. Burrus was dead. Seneca was marginalized. Agrippina was dead. Octavia was dead. Britannicus had been dead for years. The people who might have constrained Nero's behavior or provided alternative centers of authority were gone. He was surrounded by people like Tigellinus, who encouraged rather than limited his impulses. This did not make Nero a monster. It made him an emperor operating without effective constraints in a system that provided no institutional checks on imperial power. Every emperor had to navigate this situation. Some, like Augustus or Vespasian, found ways to exercise restraint and maintain support. Others, like Caligula or Nero, made increasingly destructive choices as the normal mechanisms of accountability broke down. The difference was not necessarily in their inherent character, but in the specific dynamics of how power and fear interacted in their particular reigns. The killing of Agrippina in 59 CE requires careful analysis because it has become so heavily mythologized that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. The sources describe the event with theatrical detail: the collapsing boat, Agrippina's survival and swim to shore, her final words as soldiers broke into her villa, her directing the sword toward her womb where she had carried Nero. These stories read like staged drama, not reliable history. What seems most likely is that Nero decided to kill his mother, that the initial attempt failed, and that she was eventually murdered by soldiers. The specific methods and circumstances are less certain. The collapsing boat may be historical, or may be an embellishment added later to make the story more dramatic. Ancient historians often shaped their narratives to fit moral lessons or tragic patterns, and a matricide committed by an emperor was too important a moment not to embellish. The question of why Nero made this decision has occupied historians for 2 millennia. The sources provide various motivations: Agrippina's continued attempts to influence policy, her threats to support alternative claimants to the throne, Nero's desire for independence, encouragement from Poppaea Sabina, who wanted to become empress. Modern historians add structural explanations. Agrippina represented the old system of guided rule that Nero was trying to escape. Her continued presence reminded everyone of the violence and manipulation that had brought Nero to power. She knew too much about the circumstances of Claudius's death and Britannicus's death. All these explanations share a common thread. Agrippina had become a political problem that Nero believed could only be solved through her death. In the imperial system, this was how problems were solved. Rivals were killed. Threats were eliminated. The emperor's survival depended on being willing to use violence preemptively against anyone who might challenge his position. The aftermath of the murder reveals how the imperial system processed such events. Nero reportedly felt immediate fear that the killing would trigger opposition. He allegedly considered fleeing or preparing for military resistance. But when the Senate and Praetorian Guard accepted the official story of a foiled conspiracy, when no provincial governor rose in revolt, when the people of Rome showed no outrage, he understood that he had survived the crisis. This non-reaction was itself significant. It meant that killing one's mother was not, in fact, beyond the boundaries of acceptable imperial behavior. It meant that the Senate and military would accept almost any action, as long as it was presented as necessary for security. It meant that the emperor's capacity for violence was so well established that even matricide would not trigger organized resistance. But the murder changed how people viewed Nero, and changed how Nero viewed his own position. The senatorial class began to understand that this emperor would kill anyone, regardless of familial or social bonds. If he could kill the woman who had made him emperor, he could certainly kill senators who questioned his policies. Fear became the dominant emotion in relationships between Nero and the elite. For Nero himself, the successful murder may have clarified the nature of his power. He had committed an act that violated the most basic social and religious norms. He had killed his mother, and he had survived. The gods had not struck him down. The people had not revolted. The Senate had praised him. This suggested that there were no meaningful limits to what an emperor could do, no line that could not be crossed, no action so transgressive that it would automatically trigger consequences. This is the logic that drives autocratic escalation. Each boundary crossed without consequence makes the next boundary seem less significant. Each murder successfully committed makes the next murder easier to justify. Each act of violence that fails to trigger organized opposition reinforces the belief that violence is an effective tool for managing political problems. The ancient sources claim that Nero was haunted by guilt after killing Agrippina, that he suffered nightmares and anxiety, that he sought religious purification. These accounts fit the literary convention that matricides are psychologically tormented by their crimes, but they are difficult to verify, and may be later inventions designed to moralize the story. What is more certain is that Agrippina's death removed one of the last restraints on Nero's behavior. She had been a connection to the circumstances of his accession, a reminder of the deals and compromises that had made him emperor. Her death severed that connection. It allowed Nero to reimagine himself not as someone placed on the throne through his mother's manipulation, but as an emperor in his own right, unlimited by obligations to the past. The years immediately following the matricide showed increasing independence in Nero's behavior. He began to perform publicly despite senatorial disapproval. He started appearing at theatrical performances and chariot races, not as a spectator, but as a participant. He organized festivals and games that showcased his artistic talents. These performances were not just personal indulgences, they were political statements about the nature of imperial authority. Traditional Roman aristocratic values emphasized dignified restraint and maintained clear boundaries between different social classes. Emperors were supposed to be military leaders and administrators, not performers and artists. By rejecting these conventions, Nero was asserting that imperial power meant freedom from social constraints, that being emperor meant he could do whatever he wanted regardless of tradition. The Senate found this deeply threatening, not because performance itself was dangerous, but because it suggested an emperor who did not feel bound by the norms that made aristocratic society stable. If the emperor could ignore conventions about proper behavior, what other conventions might he ignore? Property rights, legal procedures, the sanctity of senatorial rank? The anxiety was not really about theater. It was about the erosion of predictable social order. For the broader population of Rome, Nero's performances may have been popular or at least acceptable. Public entertainments were a normal part of urban life. An emperor who performed showed himself to the people in a direct way, breaking down the distance between ruler and ruled. This could be interpreted as democratic or populist, the emperor as entertainer rather than as distant military commander. But this popularity with the general population made the Senate more nervous, not less. It suggested that Nero might be building a base of support independent of the traditional aristocracy. It raised the possibility that an emperor could appeal directly to the urban masses over the heads of the Senate. This was dangerous because it undermined the Senate's role as mediator between emperor and people. By the early 60s CE, the relationship between Nero and the senatorial class was characterized by mutual fear and distrust. Senators feared that Nero would kill them on suspicion of disloyalty. Nero feared that senators were plotting against him. Neither side could trust the other, but both were locked into a system that gave them no way to resolve their conflicts except through the emperor's will. The structure that Seneca and Burrus had created to stabilize the regime had collapsed. What replaced it was naked power operating through fear, Nero's increasing focus on public performance has been interpreted in various ways. Hostile senatorial sources present it as debauchery, a sign of tyrannical madness. Some modern historians see it as deliberate political strategy to build popular support. Others view it as genuine artistic interest that Nero valued more than traditional politics. The reality likely combines these elements. The specific performances varied. Nero sang and played the lyre in musical competitions. He acted in theatrical productions, sometimes taking roles from Greek tragedy. He raced chariots, competing against professional drivers. He participated in Greek-style athletic competitions, including the Olympic Games during his trip to Greece in 66 to 67 CE. Roman aristocratic culture had complex attitudes toward these activities. Theater, music, and athletics were enjoyed as spectator entertainment, but performing them publicly was considered degrading for anyone of high status. This distinction was deeply embedded in ideas about social hierarchy. Professional performers were often slaves or freedmen. For an emperor to perform was to confuse these categories in ways that threatened social order. Greek culture had different values. In the Greek East, athletic and artistic competitions were prestigious. Winners were celebrated as embodying human excellence. Performing in these contests was honorable. Nero's interest in Greek cultural forms may have reflected genuine appreciation for these values or convenient justification for activities he wanted to pursue. His trip to Greece in 66 to 67 CE represented the fullest expression of this interest. He participated in competitions at multiple festivals, including the Olympic Games. The sources claim he won every competition, with organizers too frightened to judge him honestly. Whether accurate or not, his participation was treated as cultural triumph by Greek communities who appreciated having an emperor who valued their traditions. But in Rome, this trip was seen very differently. Nero was absent from the capital for more than a year, participating in cultural events while neglecting military and administrative responsibilities. The Senate viewed his focus on performance as dangerous distraction from actual governing. They saw him degrading the dignity of imperial office by behaving like an entertainer rather than a ruler. The political consequences were significant. Nero's performances created a wedge between him and the senatorial aristocracy. They reinforced perception that he did not share traditional Roman values, that he preferred Greek culture, that he cared more about artistic recognition than military glory or administrative competence. At the same time, his performances may have built genuine popularity among the urban population of Rome. An emperor who participated directly in entertainments rather than just sponsoring them engaged with the people in a more immediate way. This created a pattern that would recur in later imperial history. Emperors who built support among the army or urban population while alienating the Senate. The imperial system allowed for different bases of power. An emperor did not strictly need senatorial support as long as he controlled the military and maintained economic distributions to the urban poor. But governing without senatorial cooperation made administration more difficult and created permanent tension. The construction of the Domus Aurea, Nero's massive palace complex in central Rome, reflected similar tensions. After the Great Fire, Nero appropriated large areas of the city center to build an enormous residence featuring artificial lakes, parklands, and elaborate architecture. The sources describe it as an attempt to create a private paradise in the heart of the city, complete with a colossal statue of Nero depicted as the sun god. The palace was architecturally innovative and lavishly decorated. It represented the cutting edge of Roman engineering and artistic achievement. But politically, it was a disaster. Nero was seen as taking public land for private pleasure, while ordinary Romans rebuilt after the fire. The construction seemed to prioritize his comfort over the city's needs. These projects reveal fundamental misunderstanding of imperial power. Nero seemed to believe being emperor meant he could do whatever he wanted. In one sense, this was true. He had absolute authority, and no one could legally prevent him. But imperial power depended on maintaining enough support from key constituencies that no organized opposition could form. Every emperor had to navigate this tension between unlimited theoretical power and practical political constraints. Augustus had managed it by maintaining the fiction of republican government. Vespasian would later manage it by projecting military competence and administrative efficiency. Nero managed it poorly, making choices that satisfied his personal preferences while eroding his political support. By the mid-60s CE, this erosion was becoming visible. Senators privately discussed their dissatisfaction. Provincial governors began to calculate whether supporting Nero remained in their interest. Military commanders assessed whether the emperor commanded enough loyalty to suppress a revolt. In July of 64 CE, a fire started in the commercial district near the Circus Maximus in Rome. It burned for 6 days, consuming large portions of the city. The sources provide varying estimates of the destruction, but it clearly represented one of the most catastrophic urban disasters in Roman history. Large areas of the city were destroyed. Thousands of people lost their homes. Important temples and public buildings were damaged or demolished. The question of how the fire started and whether Nero was involved has generated controversy for 2,000 years. The ancient sources provide different accounts. Tacitus presents rumors that Nero started the fire deliberately to clear space for his building projects, but he does not endorse these rumors as fact. Suetonius claims Nero started the fire and then performed a musical piece about the fall of Troy while watching the city burn. Cassius Dio provides similar allegations. Later, Christian sources claim Nero blamed Christians for the fire and used it as a pretext for persecution. Modern historians are skeptical of the claim that Nero started the fire. Urban fires were common in ancient Rome, where buildings were densely packed, constructed partly of wood and lit by open flames. No arson was necessary to explain a catastrophic fire in such conditions. The story that Nero performed while Rome burned serves too perfectly as a symbol of tyrannical indifference to be trusted as historical fact. It is almost certainly invented or exaggerated. What is more certain is Nero's response to the fire. He organized relief efforts, opening imperial buildings to house refugees. He arranged for food supplies to be distributed to those who had lost everything. He implemented new building codes requiring wider streets, stone construction, and other fire prevention measures. These were competent administrative responses to a crisis. But he also used the fire as an opportunity to pursue building projects that served his own interests. Large areas of the city center that had been destroyed were incorporated into the grounds of his new palace, the Domus Aurea. This created the impression that he was profiting from the disaster, that he was using the city's tragedy to expand his personal territory. The sources also describe persecution of Christians following the fire. According to Tacitus, Nero blamed Christians for starting the fire and subjected them to various forms of execution, including being burned alive or torn apart by dogs during public spectacles. This account is the earliest Roman reference to Christian persecution and has been foundational for Christian historical memory. Modern historians debate various aspects of this persecution. Some question whether it happened at all, noting that Tacitus is the only significant source and that his account might be influenced by later Christian traditions. Others accept that some persecution occurred, but question the scale and specific details. The relationship between Christianity and the Roman state in the 60s AE is poorly documented, and it is difficult to know how visible Christians were as a distinct group or how they would have been perceived by Roman authorities. What seems most likely is that in the aftermath of the fire, with public anger running high and explanations being sought, Nero or his advisors identified Christians as a convenient scapegoat. Christians were a small, poorly understood group who could be blamed without creating significant political problems. Whether this blame was based on any actual evidence or was purely strategic is impossible to determine. The fire and its aftermath damaged Nero's political position in multiple ways. It demonstrated the vulnerability of Rome itself to catastrophic disaster. It created economic hardship and displacement for large numbers of people. The visible appropriation of destroyed land for imperial building projects reinforced the perception that Nero prioritized his own interests over the public good. The massive cost of rebuilding strained imperial finances and required increased taxation, which created resentment in the provinces. The rebuilding program itself was ambitious and in many ways successful. The new building codes created a safer, more organized urban environment. The wider streets and stone construction reduced fire risk. The architectural innovations introduced during Reconstruction influenced later Roman urban planning. From a technical administrative perspective, the response to the fire was reasonably effective. But politically, the fire marked a turning point. It crystallized existing anxieties about Nero's rule. It provided concrete evidence that could be interpreted as confirming suspicions about his priorities. It created economic strain that made various constituencies less willing to tolerate other aspects of his governance. The combination of physical destruction, financial burden, and visible self-interest eroded the remaining support Nero had among groups who might have defended him. The sources, written decades later by hostile senatorial historians, used the fire as a symbol of everything wrong with Nero's reign. They portrayed it as divine punishment for tyranny or as evidence of his madness. They embedded it in a narrative of escalating corruption and violence. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned became one of the most enduring symbols of irresponsible leadership, even though it was almost certainly fictional. Separating the historical fire from the later mythologizing is difficult. The fire happened. It was devastating. Nero responded with a combination of relief efforts and self-serving building projects. These facts are reasonably well established. Everything else, whether he started it, whether he performed during it, how he felt about it, what his true motivations were, exists in the realm of interpretation and propaganda. What matters for understanding Nero's reign is not the mythology, but the political consequences. The fire created conditions that made opposition more viable. It strained resources that might have been used to maintain support. It provided a focal point for existing dissatisfaction with Nero's rule. It demonstrated that catastrophic events could happen that were beyond imperial control, but for which the emperor would be blamed regardless. The fire also revealed the limits of imperial power. An emperor could command armies, execute senators, and appropriate land, but he could not prevent disasters or control how people interpreted events. Public opinion, though difficult to measure in an autocratic system, still mattered. When enough people believed that an emperor was incompetent or malevolent or self-interested, that belief became a political fact with real consequences, regardless of whether it was objectively true. By the end of 64 CE, Nero's position was weakening. He had lost his early advisors. He had alienated large portions of the Senate through executions and forced suicides. He had spent enormous sums on building projects and entertainments. He had survived a major urban catastrophe, but had not emerged strengthened. The structure of support that maintained imperial power was beginning to crack. The discovery of the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 CIE revealed the extent of opposition to Nero and how that opposition would be crushed. The conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, involved stabbing Nero during games at the Circus Maximus. The plot included senators, military officers, and even Praetorian guards, precisely the groups whose support was necessary for an emperor's survival. The conspiracy failed because someone informed on the plotters. Once exposed, the investigation spread rapidly. Torture extracted confessions and accusations. Each person arrested implicated others. Whether all of them were actually involved, or whether some were caught in cycles of false accusation, remains uncertain. The response was severe. Piso was forced to commit suicide, as was Seneca. Lucan, the poet, was also killed. Numerous senators and military officers faced execution or forced suicide. The Praetorian prefect Phaeanius Rufus, implicated in the conspiracy, was executed. Property was confiscated. Families were destroyed. Seneca's death carries particular weight because of his role in Nero's early reign. The philosopher who had tried to guide the young emperor toward rational governance died on that emperor's orders, forced to open his veins. The sources describe his final moments with literary detail. His calm philosophical discourse, his comparison to Socrates. These accounts are shaped by the tradition of philosophical martyrdom and may not be historically accurate, but they represent how educated Romans wanted to remember his death. The conspiracy changed Nero's government. What had been a system operating through fear and cooperation became one operating almost purely through fear. Senators understood that accusation could come at any moment, that survival depended on demonstrating loyalty while avoiding any appearance of ambition. The space for even limited opposition disappeared. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. As Nero became more fearful, he became more aggressive in eliminating potential threats. This aggression made more people consider him dangerous, which increased the likelihood of actual conspiracy. Increased conspiracy justified more repression, which alienated more people. The spiral of fear and violence became the dominant characteristic of the regime. The next year, another conspiracy was discovered or claimed to have been discovered. This one allegedly involved Corbulo, the successful general who had managed the Armenian campaign, and several provincial governors. All were ordered to commit suicide. Whether they were actually planning revolt, or whether Nero simply feared their military capacity is unclear. These purges removed competent administrators and military commanders from positions of authority. They discouraged capable people from accepting important posts because such positions made them targets. They created administrative instability. They undermined governance quality by prioritizing loyalty over ability. The financial cost of Nero's building projects combined with military expenses and economic disruption from the Great Fire, created increasing fiscal pressure. The traditional solution was to confiscate the property of wealthy individuals accused of crimes. Conspiracy trials provided a mechanism for this. Convicted conspirators lost property to the imperial treasury. This created perverse incentive to find conspiracies because doing so both eliminated threats and solved financial problems. The prosecution of conspiracies also maintained the fiction of imperial legitimacy. By framing opposition as criminal conspiracy rather than political disagreement, the regime could claim it defended lawful authority against illegal plots. This allowed violent repression while maintaining the appearance that the legal system functioned normally. Trials were held, evidence presented, verdicts reached, all following proper procedures, though everyone understood outcomes were predetermined. Tigellinus, as Praetorian prefect, played a central role in managing repression. He coordinated investigations, supervised interrogations, and ensured suspected conspirators were eliminated. His prominence made him both feared and hated among the senatorial class. By 67 CE, when Nero left Rome for his extended trip to Greece, the political situation had fundamentally changed from his early reign. The Senate had been cowed through systematic violence. The Praetorian Guard had been purged of anyone suspected of disloyalty. Opposition had been driven underground, forced to operate in secret rather than through any open political process. This appeared to make Nero's position more secure. He had eliminated known threats. He had demonstrated willingness to use violence preemptively. He had concentrated power in people who depended on him. But this security was illusory. It depended on continued cooperation of the military and Praetorian Guard. It assumed fear would be more powerful than resentment. It ignored the possibility that provincial crisis might provide opportunity for someone to challenge imperial authority. The trip to Greece represented either remarkable confidence or dangerous complacency. Nero spent more than a year away from Rome, participating in festivals and competitions. This suggested he believed his position was stable enough to tolerate extended absence. But it demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of how imperial power worked. Emperors maintained authority through presence, through daily exercise of patronage and intimidation. An absent emperor created space for others to build alternative centers of power. By 68 CE, Nero had been emperor for nearly 14 years. He had survived conspiracies, executed rivals, built massive monuments, and pursued artistic interests despite senatorial opposition. He controlled the capital, the Praetorian Guard, and the machinery of imperial administration. But he had systematically alienated or eliminated almost everyone whose support had brought him to power. The Senate despised him. Decades of executions, forced suicides, and property confiscations had created a body of men who feared the emperor but did not support him. They complied with his demands because they had no choice, but they would not defend him if a credible alternative emerged. The military situation was more complex. The legions were stationed in the provinces, far from Rome. Their primary concern was maintaining order on the frontiers and protecting their own interests. As long as the emperor did not interfere and ensured they were paid, they had little reason to care who held the throne. But this indifference could turn dangerous if provincial governors decided to challenge Nero's authority. The urban population of Rome may have maintained some genuine support for Nero. He had provided games, entertainments, and economic distributions. His public performances made him visible and accessible. but popular support in the capital meant less than military support in the provinces. Nero's court had become a place of fear and suspicion. Tigellinus maintained security through informants and preemptive violence. Anyone who seemed to have independent authority became a potential threat. The constant paranoia about conspiracy made normal political relationships impossible. This isolation was reinforced by Nero's focus on performance and Greek culture. He spent time with actors, musicians, and artists, people who shared his interests but who had no political power or military authority. These relationships did not generate the kind of support that mattered for maintaining imperial power. Administrative quality had deteriorated. The purges had removed experienced administrators. Positions were filled based on loyalty rather than competence. Provincial governors were selected for their lack of independent authority rather than governing ability. This created inefficiency and resentment. Financial pressure continued to mount. The building projects were enormously expensive. Games and distributions required constant funding. The military needed pay and supplies. Traditional revenue sources were not sufficient, which created pressure to increase taxation or find other income sources. The coinage was debased, silver content reduced, allowing the government to mint more coins from the same precious metal. This was a standard response to fiscal pressure, but it had long-term economic consequences. It contributed to inflation and eroded confidence in imperial currency. In the provinces, fiscal pressure translated into increased tax burdens. Provincial populations were squeezed to fund the emperor's projects in Rome. This created resentment and reduced loyalty to the regime. The eastern provinces, particularly Greece, had received special treatment from Nero. He had participated in Greek festivals, granted tax exemptions, and expressed admiration for Greek culture. This created some goodwill in the east, but reinforced perception in the West that Nero favored Greek culture over Roman traditions. These accumulated tensions did not automatically produce crisis. The imperial system had survived worse emperors and more serious problems. Empires have enormous inertia. They continue functioning through momentum and established procedures even when the center is weak. The key question was not whether people were dissatisfied, many clearly were, but whether anyone was willing to openly challenge him. Challenging an emperor meant risking everything. It meant potential execution for treason. It meant betting that you could assemble enough military and political support to actually win. For 14 years, no one had been willing to take that risk in a sustained way. The Pisonian conspiracy had failed before it began. Individual senators had been executed for suspected disloyalty, but no provincial governor had raised legions in revolt. But by early 68 CE, the mathematics of that calculation were beginning to shift. Nero's long absence in Greece had demonstrated that imperial authority did not require the emperor's physical presence. The fiscal pressure was creating genuine hardship. The purges had created a pool of resentful families. Military commanders were assessing whether their legions would follow them. The imperial system had a fundamental instability built into it. There was no legitimate way to remove an emperor except through his death. Emperors could not be voted out or peacefully replaced. They could only be assassinated or forced to commit suicide. This meant that every dissatisfied faction had to consider violence as their only option for changing leadership. In March of 68 CE, while Nero was still in Greece or recently returned to Italy, Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, raised a revolt. Vindex commanded significant military forces and controlled wealthy provinces. His rebellion was not motivated by personal ambition to become emperor. He was a Gaul, and understood that the Roman system would not accept a provincial governor of non-Italian origin as emperor. Instead, he declared his support for Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, as an alternative to Nero. Galba was an elderly senator from a distinguished family who had governed Spain for several years. He had military experience and aristocratic credentials. He represented exactly the kind of traditional Roman leadership that Nero did not. By declaring for Galba, Vindex was providing a credible alternative around which opposition could coalesce. The revolt spread quickly. Other governors began calculating their positions. Would Nero be able to suppress the rebellion? Would other provinces join Vindex? Would the Praetorian Guard remain loyal? Each governor had to assess whether supporting Nero or supporting the rebellion served their interests better. The very existence of a credible alternative made opposition viable. Nero's initial response was to organize military resistance. He began assembling forces to march against Vindex, but this required mobilizing legions, coordinating logistics, and demonstrating military competence. Nero had no military experience. He had never commanded troops in battle. His credibility as a military leader was non-existent. The contrast with Galba, who had actual military credentials, was stark. In April, Vindex's forces were defeated by loyalist legions commanded by Lucius Virginius Rufus, governor of Germania Superior. Vindex himself died, either in battle or by suicide. This should have been a victory for Nero. The rebellion had been crushed. The alternative claimant's main military supporter was dead. The provinces should have returned to loyalty, but the victory did not restore Nero's position. Galba did not abandon his claim to the throne. Other governors did not rush to reaffirm their loyalty. The Senate did not celebrate Nero's survival. Instead, the military success against Vindex revealed that provincial governors commanded loyal legions who would fight effectively. But those legions might fight for or against the emperor depending on their commander's calculations. The critical failure came from the Praetorian Guard. These were the troops stationed in Rome, the military force that had made and unmade emperors since Caligula's assassination. Their loyalty was what ultimately mattered. If the Praetorians supported Nero, he could survive provincial rebellions. If they turned against him, he was finished. In early June, the Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus made his move. He told the guard that Nero had fled or was planning to flee, that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, and that Galba was now emperor. He promised the guard a generous payment from Galba in exchange for their loyalty. The Praetorians accepted this offer. They abandoned Nero. This betrayal was the mechanism through which emperors fell. The Praetorian Guard existed to protect the emperor, but they protected whoever paid them and whoever seemed likely to win. Their loyalty was transactional. When the price was right and the alternative seemed viable, they switched sides. This had happened before and would happen again. It was built into the structure of the imperial system. The Senate, seeing that the Praetorians had abandoned Nero, declared him a public enemy. This was the formal legal fiction that transformed a living emperor into a criminal. It meant that anyone could kill him without consequence. It meant that his property was forfeit. It meant that he had no legal protection or status. The Senate, that had praised him and voted him honors for 14 years now, condemned him in the same formulaic way they had condemned previous fallen emperors. Nero was not present for this Senate meeting. He was at a villa outside Rome when he learned that the praetorians had switched their loyalty and that the Senate had declared him an enemy. He was now in physical danger. People who had served him began disappearing, not wanting to be associated with a fallen emperor. The machinery that had maintained his power for 14 years collapsed within days. He reportedly considered various options. He might flee to Egypt, where he still had some support. He might appeal to the legions in the east. He might try to rally the urban population of Rome, who had supported his public performances. But none of these options were actually viable. He had no military force under his direct command. He had no safe place to go. He had no way to reverse the momentum that was now moving against him. The sources describe him moving between villas, trying to find people who would protect him, discovering that former allies were no longer willing to associate with him. Doors that had always been open were suddenly closed. Guards who had protected him were gone. The entire structure of imperial power, which had seemed permanent and absolute, had dissolved almost overnight. This collapse reveals the essential fragility of the imperial system. An emperor's power depended entirely on the continued cooperation of key groups: the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, provincial governors, military commanders. These groups cooperated not out of loyalty or legal obligation, but because it served their interests. When it stopped serving their interests, they stopped cooperating. There was no constitutional mechanism to manage this transition, no legal procedure for transferring power. It happened through betrayal and abandonment. The speed of the collapse was striking. In March, Nero was emperor. By early June, he was a fugitive. Nothing about the empire's actual capacity to function had changed. The legions still controlled the frontiers. The provinces still paid taxes. The administrative machinery still operated. But the person at the center of the system had lost the support necessary to maintain his position, and that was sufficient to end his reign. What remained was the question of how he would die. The Senate had declared him a public enemy, which meant execution by traditional Roman methods, being beaten to death with rods. Nero wanted to avoid this fate. He would need to find another way to end his life before he was captured. Nero spent his final night at the villa of Phaon, a freedman who had been part of his household. The sources describe him hiding in a small room, contemplating suicide but unable to bring himself to act. He allegedly composed poetry, rehearsed phrases about the loss of artistic talent, and asked those still with him to begin the funeral preparations. These details come from hostile accounts and may be embellished, but they fit the pattern of someone in shock at how completely his position had disintegrated. The question of how to die became urgent. He could hear that soldiers were approaching to arrest him. The Senate's declaration meant he would be executed publicly if captured. The traditional method for a condemned public enemy was being beaten to death, a humiliating and painful end. Suicide was the alternative, faster, more controllable, and maintaining some dignity. Roman aristocratic culture had complex attitudes toward suicide. It could be seen as honorable when chosen, freely to avoid dishonor, or as cowardly when used to escape consequences. For condemned senators and imperial officials, forced suicide was standard. They would be given the choice to kill themselves rather than be executed, which allowed them to preserve some dignity and sometimes protect their family's property. Nero was now in the position of someone facing forced suicide, except there was no authority offering him the choice. He had to impose it on himself. The sources claim he struggled to commit the act, that he could not bring himself to use the knife, that he needed help from a secretary named Epaphroditos to complete the suicide. He allegedly said, "Qualis artifex pereo," "What an artist dies in me," as his final words. This phrase has been endlessly analyzed and interpreted. Some see it as genuine regret for lost artistic potential. Others see it as narcissistic self-dramatization. Most likely, if it was actually said, it reflected Nero's own understanding of himself as primarily an artist rather than an emperor. He died on June 9, 68 CE, at age 30. He had ruled for 13 years and 8 months. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line that had ruled Rome since Augustus established the imperial system. There were no obvious heirs, no clear succession mechanism, no established procedure for choosing the next emperor. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Galba claimed the throne and began moving toward Rome. Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero, was killed by his own troops when he seemed to be pursuing the throne for himself. The Senate celebrated Nero's death and began dismantling the most visible symbols of his reign. The colossal statue was removed. Plans were made to destroy the Domus Aurea. The memory of Nero as emperor was to be erased. But Galba's reign was brief and unstable. He was elderly, rigid, and unwilling to pay the bounties promised to the troops. In January of 69 CE, he was killed by the Praetorian Guard and replaced by Otho. Otho lasted 3 months before being defeated by Vitellius, who commanded the German legions. Vitellius held power for 8 months before being killed by forces supporting Vespasian. This period, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, revealed the fundamental instability of the imperial system when succession was unclear. Once the precedent was established that provincial governors could claim the throne and that the Praetorian Guard would support whoever paid them best, there was no mechanism to prevent civil war. Multiple claimants emerged, each backed by different military forces, each claiming legitimacy through force of arms. Vespasian eventually stabilized the situation. He was a military commander with strong legionary support and no connection to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His accession marked a break with the previous system. Emperors no longer needed to claim descent from Augustus to be legitimate. Military power and administrative competence were sufficient. This was both more honest and more unstable, removing even the fiction of hereditary right. For Nero personally, death meant the end of agency but the beginning of historical interpretation. The sources that survived were written by men who had lived through his reign, or who relied on accounts from people who had opposed him. They had every incentive to portray him as a monster, to emphasize his crimes and ignore any competent governance, to create a narrative in which his fall was both inevitable and deserved. Christian sources added another layer of hostility. The tradition that Nero had persecuted Christians after the Great Fire made him a figure of particular evil in Christian historical memory. Even if the persecution was limited in scope and motivated by political scapegoating rather than religious persecution per se, it became a foundational element of Christian martyrology. Nero became the archetypal persecutor, the enemy of the faith, the tyrant who killed the apostles Peter and Paul. These various hostile traditions combined to create the Nero of historical memory, the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, who killed his mother and wives for trivial reasons, who persecuted Christians for entertainment, who represents the absolute corruption of absolute power. This Nero has dominated historical consciousness for 2,000 years. Separating this mythological figure from the historical reality of a young emperor trapped in an impossible system requires careful analysis of biased sources and attention to the structural factors that shaped his reign. Stripping away the accumulated mythology reveals a more complex and less dramatic figure than the monster of historical tradition. Nero was a person placed in an impossible position at age 16, given absolute power within a system that provided no institutional constraints, surrounded by people who had used murder to advance their interests, and expected to navigate court politics that had killed most of his family members. His early reign, guided by Seneca and Burrus, demonstrated that the imperial system could function reasonably well when the emperor had competent advisors and was willing to be guided by them. Policies were rational. Administration was effective. The Senate was consulted. Legal procedures were followed. This suggests that Nero was capable of participating in functional government when the right structure existed around him. The deterioration of his reign followed the breakdown of this structure. Agrippina's death removed one constraint. Burrus's death removed another. Seneca's marginalization removed the philosophical framework that had shaped early policy. What replaced these constraints was not some inherent evil in Nero's character, but the logic of autocratic power operating without checks. The specific choices Nero made, the public performances, the massive building projects, the executions of suspected conspirators, were not random acts of madness. They were responses to the incentives and pressures created by the imperial system. Performance built popular support and satisfied personal interests. Building projects demonstrated power and provided patronage. Executions eliminated threats and generated revenue through confiscation. These choices were destructive because they alienated key constituencies whose support Nero needed to survive. The Senate opposed public performance because it violated aristocratic norms. The building projects drained resources that might have been used to maintain military loyalty. The executions created fear but also resentment and eventually active conspiracy. The miscalculation was political, not moral. The question of Nero's personal responsibility for specific crimes, Agrippina's death, Britannicus's death, Octavia's death, the various executions, is complicated by the hostile nature of the sources. We know that people died. We know that Nero's orders or acquiescence were involved. We do not know the exact circumstances, the specific motivations, or whether alternatives existed that Nero rejected. What seems most likely is that Nero operated within the standard logic of imperial politics. Rivals and threats were eliminated. Family members who might challenge power were killed. Conspirators were executed. Property was confiscated. These were not innovations. They were standard imperial practices that had been followed by Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Nero's difference was not in using these tools, but in using them less skillfully and in ways that eroded rather than maintained his support. The Great Fire stands as a particular example of how mythology has overwhelmed history. The fire happened. It was catastrophic. Nero responded with a combination of relief efforts and opportunistic building projects. The story that he started the fire or performed while it burned was almost certainly invented by hostile sources to symbolize his tyranny. But the invented story has become the historical memory, displacing the more mundane reality of urban disaster and political miscalculation. The persecution of Christians, if it occurred as described, was not religious persecution in the modern sense. It was political scapegoating, using a small and poorly understood group to deflect blame for a disaster. This does not make it less morally troubling, but it does place it within the context of Roman political practice, rather than representing some unique evil specific to Nero. The collapse of Nero's reign was structural, not personal. The imperial system created emperors through violence and maintained them through fear. When the balance of fear shifted, when provincial governors calculated that revolt was less dangerous than continued loyalty, when the Praetorian Guard determined that switching sides was in their interest, the emperor fell. This had happened before Nero and would happen after him. His particular collapse was faster and more complete than some others, but it followed the same pattern. The historical Nero was a young ruler who started with significant advantages, who presided over reasonably effective government during his early reign, who gradually made choices that eroded his political support, who became increasingly isolated and paranoid as opposition emerged, and who died abandoned by the forces that had maintained his power. This is a political tragedy, not a moral fable about inherent evil. The mythological Nero, the mad tyrant, the persecutor of Christians, the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, served important purposes for later writers. He symbolized the dangers of autocracy. He provided a negative example against which to contrast better emperors. He demonstrated the moral that tyranny inevitably leads to destruction. These purposes shaped how the sources presented him and how history has remembered him. Understanding the historical Nero requires looking past these moralizing narratives to the structural factors that shaped his reign. The imperial system was inherently unstable. Succession was determined by violence. Constraints on power were informal and easily eroded. The emperor's personality mattered, but it mattered within a framework that created certain incentives and punished certain choices regardless of individual character. Nero's reign demonstrates what happens when that framework breaks down, when the informal constraints fail, when the emperor's support erodes past the point where it can be recovered. The result was not unprecedented, but it was catastrophic for Nero personally and destabilizing for the empire. It revealed the essential fragility of a system that concentrated absolute power in a single person, while providing no legitimate mechanism for removing that person if he lost support. That fragility, not Nero's individual failings, is what ultimately explains both his rise and his fall.